Ethan Walker had learned a long time ago that the difference between a good engineer and a great one was what happened after everyone else went home. At 6:15 on a Tuesday evening, the 14th floor of Titan Technologies was empty, except for the low hum of server racks and the pale blue glow of 3 monitors arranged in a shallow arc around a man who hadn't moved from his chair in 4 hours. Outside the window, the city was already lit up gold and orange, commuters pouring toward trains, taillights stretching in slow red ribbons down the avenue below. But up here it was just Ethan, the quiet click of his keyboard, and a wall of code that only he, in the entire building, truly understood in its bones. He had written most of it himself over 12 years, line by line, the way a mason lays brick. Not glamorous work, but the kind that keeps buildings standing during earthquakes nobody ever sees coming. He rubbed his eyes and took a sip of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago without his noticing. On the corner of his desk sat a photograph in a cheap plastic frame, its edge slightly chipped from being packed and unpacked across 3 different desks over the years. A woman with dark curly hair laughing at something just out of frame, one arm wrapped around a toddler who was clearly mid-squirm, trying to escape the camera. Ethan glanced at it the way he did dozens of times a day, an old habit that had never worn down into background noise. Sarah had been gone 5 years now, but some mornings it still felt like 4, and some nights, like tonight, it felt like no time had passed at all. He thought unbidden of the last good week they'd had together, before the headaches got bad enough that she finally agreed to see someone. They'd taken Lily to the beach, and Sarah had stood ankle-deep in the cold water with her jeans rolled up, laughing at how furiously their daughter refused to let go of a horseshoe crab shell she'd found, insisting it was basically a pet now. Sarah had turned to him with sand on her cheek and said, apropos of nothing, "You know you're going to build something amazing someday, right? Not for them, for her." He hadn't understood what she meant at the time. He understood it better with every year that passed. His phone buzzed, pulling him back into the present. A text from Mrs. Alvarez, the after-school coordinator. "Lily's the last one here. She's fine, just waiting on the bench by the office. No rush, but wanted you to know." Ethan closed his eyes for a second, feeling the familiar twist of guilt settle low in his stomach. 3rd time this month. He typed back, "On my way. Thank you so much. I'm so sorry," and was already pulling his jacket off the back of his chair when his phone buzzed again, this time a calendar alert pushed to the whole company. Mandatory all-staff meeting, Friday 10th a.m. Major announcement from the CEO. He didn't think much of it in the moment. Titan held all-staff meetings the way some companies ran fire drills. Frequent, mostly forgettable, usually just Marcus Cole standing on a small stage congratulating everyone on numbers most of the room had never actually seen up close. Ethan grabbed his backpack, killed the monitors, and headed for the elevator, already rehearsing in his head the small, ordinary apology he'd give his daughter for being 15 minutes later than promised again. On his way out, he passed the open door of the platform team's shared office, where Thomas Reyes was still hunched over his keyboard, a half-eaten sandwich forgotten beside his mouse. "You heading out?" Thomas called. "Lily's waiting. You should go home too, man. Your kids miss you." Thomas laughed, tired. "Tell that to this deployment queue." He gestured vaguely at his screen. "Hey, you hear about Friday?" "Big announcement. CTO seat, probably," Ethan said, shrugging into his jacket. "Long overdue." "About time," Thomas said, grinning. "Building's gonna throw you a parade." "I'll settle for a raise," Ethan said, and they both laughed, and he didn't think about the conversation again until it came back to him 3 days later with a very different, much heavier weight. Lily was 8 years old, sitting cross-legged on a wooden bench under a mural commemorating the company's founding year, reading a paperback with a flashlight sticker stuck crookedly to the cover. When she saw her father step off the elevator, she didn't complain, didn't even look particularly bothered. She never did. She just closed the book, slid off the bench and looped her small hand into his like it was the most natural motion in the world. "You smell like the server room," she said, wrinkling her nose. "Is that bad?" "It smells like static electricity and old pizza." "That's actually a pretty accurate description of my entire career," he said, and she laughed, a real laugh, and something in his chest loosened just slightly. In the car, she told him about a math problem her teacher had put on the whiteboard that morning that nobody in the class could solve. Something about a train leaving one station and another train leaving a different station, and how she'd raised her hand and gotten it right, and how the teacher had asked, "Where did you learn to think like that?" And Lily had answered, without hesitation, "My dad's an engineer. He builds things that don't fall down." Ethan kept his eyes fixed very carefully on the road, so she wouldn't see what that sentence did to his face. "Can we get ice cream?" Lily asked. "Not because I'm sad or anything, just because Tuesdays are hard, and ice cream makes hard days easier." "That's some pretty sophisticated reasoning. I learned it from you. You always say things like that about coffee." He laughed and took the turn toward the little ice cream place on Kessler Street instead of straight home, and for 20 minutes they sat on the curb outside with 2 cones, Lily's chocolate dripping steadily down her wrist, while she talked about a girl in her class who claimed she'd seen a real UFO, and Ethan let the stress of the day dissolve into the simple, ordinary pleasure of listening to his daughter narrate the entire universe as she understood it. At home after dinner, grilled cheese because it was Tuesday and Tuesday was grilled cheese night, a small ritual they'd kept unchanged since before, one of the few things that hadn't shifted shape after Sarah died. Lily sat on the kitchen counter swinging her feet while he washed the pan and asked, the way she sometimes did out of nowhere, with the sudden gravity only children seem able to summon, "Do you think Mom would be proud of you?" Ethan set the sponge down slowly. "I hope so. I think she would. You work really hard. Sometimes I wonder if I work too hard, if I'm not around enough, if you're waiting on a bench too many afternoons because of me." Lily considered this with total seriousness, chewing on the thought the way she chewed on the last bite of her sandwich. "Mom used to say you're the smartest person she ever knew," she said finally. "She said that even when things get hard, smart people don't run away from it. They just build their way out." She shrugged, a small matter-of-fact gesture. "So I think you're doing it right. You're just building. That's what you do." He didn't tell her that lately it hadn't felt like building. It had felt like holding a roof up with his bare hands, while everyone underneath assumed the roof had always been that solid on its own, never once looking up to see who was keeping it from caving in. That night, after Lily went to bed, Ethan sat alone in the living room with Sarah's old cardigan, the one he still hadn't been able to give away, folded on the arm of the couch beside him, and let himself imagine, just for a few minutes, what it would feel like to hear his name called on Friday. Not for the money, though the money would help, not even entirely for the title, mostly because for 12 years he had shown up again and again, on the nights nobody thanked him for, and some small, tired part of him wanted just once to be seen doing it. Friday came fast, the way dreaded days always do. The all-staff meeting was held in the atrium, the only space at Titan large enough to hold 412 employees, standing shoulder to shoulder beneath a 2-story glass ceiling that flooded the room with hard morning light. Marcus Cole, the company's founder and CEO, 61 years old, a self-made billionaire who had built Titan out of a 2-car garage into one of the most valuable software companies on the East Coast, stood on a small temporary stage, a microphone clipped to the lapel of a suit that had clearly never seen the inside of an actual office cubicle. He wore the beaming showman's smile he always wore before good news, the same smile, Ethan sometimes thought, that had closed 1,000 deals over the decades, the same smile from a framed magazine cover that hung in the lobby downstairs, the one where Marcus stood in front of Titan's very first server rack, looking 20 years younger and considerably less certain of himself than he looked now. Ethan stood near the back with Priya Nandan, the sharp-eyed head of infrastructure, who had survived 3 brutal migrations at his side, and Thomas Reyes from the platform team, a quiet family man who kept a picture of his own 3 kids taped inside his laptop lid. The 3 of them had weathered a near-catastrophic data breach together 2 years earlier, catching and patching a vulnerability at 2 in the morning before a single client ever noticed, surviving on gas station coffee and the particular camaraderie that only forms among people who've watched the same disaster nearly happen and pulled each other back from the edge of it together. Priya had cried a little that night, from exhaustion more than fear, and Ethan had driven her home afterward because she was in no state to drive herself, and neither of them had ever mentioned it again, the way people who've been through something real together often don't need to. "You nervous?" Priya whispered, elbowing him lightly. "About what?" "Come on, Ethan. Everyone in this building knows you're getting the CTO seat. It's been open 4 months. You're the only name anyone actually says when people talk about it. I heard 2 people in HR arguing about who gets to run the announcement email." "I try not to think about it," Ethan said. "Feels like bad luck." "You've earned good luck," Priya said. "For once, just let yourself want something." Ethan didn't answer right away, because he genuinely hadn't let himself think about it too hard. Hope, in his experience, was a thing best rationed carefully, like the last bit of a paycheck before the next one arrived. Marcus Cole tapped the microphone twice, and the low murmur of 400 conversations dropped to silence. "Titan family," he began, his voice carrying easily even without amplification, the voice of a man who had given this kind of speech more times than he could count. 22 years ago, I started this company with 4 employees and a line of credit I probably shouldn't have taken out. Today we have 412 of the smartest people in this industry standing in this room, and I could not be prouder of what we've built together." Applause rippled through the atrium. Ethan clapped along mechanically, glancing sideways at Priya, who mouthed, "Here it comes," with a grin she couldn't quite suppress. "Today," Marcus continued, "I'm announcing our next Chief Technology Officer, someone who represents the future of this company. Someone with fresh vision, new energy, and, frankly," he chuckled at his own joke before he'd even finished it, "the Cole family bloodline running straight through Titan's DNA. It is my honor and my privilege as a father to announce that our new Chief Technology Officer is my son, Jason Cole." A young man in his late 20s stepped onto the stage, waving at the crowd with the loose, practiced ease of someone who had spent his entire life being applauded for things he hadn't yet done. His suit looked like it had never once been worn to actually work in. His shoes still had the faint sheen of something bought that week specifically for this moment. The room erupted into applause. Not Ethan would understand only much later, because anyone truly believed in the announcement, but because 400 people had collectively and instantly learned the simple corporate wisdom of clapping for whatever the man who signed their paychecks wanted them to clap for. Ethan felt Priya's hand tighten involuntarily on his arm, hard enough to leave small crescents in his skin later. He felt Tomas go completely still beside him, the way a man goes still right before he decides whether to say something he'll regret. He felt, more than anything, a strange and total silence settle over his own chest, as if someone had reached inside him and quietly flipped a switch to off. Somewhere near the front of the crowd, a junior engineer named Devon, who'd only been at Titan 8 months and had no idea what he was witnessing, turned to a colleague and whispered, "Wait, who's Jason Cole? Is he new?" The colleague hushed him without answering, and Devon, confused, went back to clapping along with everyone else, unaware that he was one of the few people in the room not performing an emotion he didn't feel. Jason Cole had been at Titan for exactly 6 months. As far as Ethan knew, he had never once opened a terminal, never reviewed a single pull request, never sat through one of the brutal, necessary post-mortems that followed every production outage. He had spent most of those 6 months, according to office rumor, in what people jokingly called strategy meetings. Long lunches with vendors his father wanted him to network with, golf outings billed as client development, a leadership offsite in Aspen that had produced, as far as anyone could tell, no actual leadership, only a company-wide email afterward titled Reflections on Synergy that nobody had fully read. Nobody looked at Ethan. That somehow was the detail that stayed with him longest in the years that followed, not the announcement itself, but the fact that in a room of 400 people who all privately, silently understood the truth of what had just happened, not a single one of them turned to see how he was taking it. It was as if the whole building had wordlessly agreed not to witness the moment, out of some shared mixture of mercy and cowardice, sparing him the added humiliation of being watched while he absorbed it. Priya finally turned to him, her face pale, mouth already forming an apology for a thing that wasn't hers to apologize for. Ethan just shook his head slightly, not now, and slipped out the side exit before the applause had even fully died down. He went back up to the 14th floor. He found a cardboard box in the supply closet, the same kind of box the shipping department used for spare keyboards, and packed his monitor cables, his framed photo of Sarah and Lily, his chipped coffee mug that read "World's Okayest Debugger," a gift from Priya 2 Christmases ago, and a small dog-eared notebook where he'd been sketching, in his own private handwriting over the past year, ideas for how he'd rebuild Titan's authentication architecture if he were ever given the authority to do it properly. He looked at that notebook for a long moment before putting it in the box, and something about packing it away felt like closing a door he hadn't realized was still open. He didn't send an email. He didn't schedule an exit interview. He simply walked out before lunch the way a man walks out of a house that is technically still standing, but is no longer, in any way that matters, his. The drive home felt unreal, the familiar streets sliding past like scenery from someone else's life. He picked Lily up early that day, and when she climbed into the car and saw the cardboard box in the back seat, she didn't ask questions right away. She was smart enough, even at 8, to read the shape of a bad day on her father's face. "Did something happen?" she finally asked, once they were a few blocks from school. Ethan considered lying, softening it, the way well-meaning parents sometimes do. He'd promised himself, though, after Sarah's diagnosis and everything that followed, that he would never protect Lily from the truth by handing her a smaller, easier version of it. "I don't work at Titan anymore," he said. "I decided to leave today." "Why?" "Because they gave the job I'd worked really hard for to somebody else, somebody who didn't earn it the way I think a job like that should be earned." Lily was quiet for a moment, processing. "That's not fair." "No," Ethan agreed, "it's not. But sometimes the world isn't fair, and the only thing you actually get to control is what you do next." "What are you going to do next?" He hadn't fully answered that question for himself yet, but hearing it asked so plainly by his own daughter, in the passenger seat of a car still smelling faintly of the crayon she kept in the door pocket, something in him steadied. "I think," he said slowly, "I'm going to build something of my own. Something nobody can take away from me by handing it to someone else instead. Can I help?" He glanced over at her, surprised, and found her looking back at him with total seriousness. "Yeah," he said, throat tight. "Actually, I think you're going to help more than you know." That night he sat down at the kitchen table with a legal pad and wrote at the top of the first page 3 words: Halcyon Security, Draft. He stared at it for a long time before he wrote anything else, and when Lily wandered downstairs for water and saw him there, she didn't say anything, just filled her cup, kissed the top of his head on her way back up the stairs, an unusually tender gesture for an 8-year-old, one she'd clearly absorbed from watching her mother do the same to him countless times, and left him to it. The first months of Halcyon Security existed almost entirely inside the guest bedroom of Ethan's house, a room that still had Sarah's reading chair pushed into the corner because he hadn't been able to bring himself to sell it. He'd used almost all of his savings to cover the first year of overhead: a laptop, liability insurance, a business license, a website he built himself over 3 sleepless nights, staring at fonts at 3 in the morning, trying to decide what typeface said trustworthy without saying desperate. He named the company Halcyon after a conversation he and Sarah used to have late at night years earlier, back when they'd lie awake dreaming about the business he'd start someday if he ever worked up the nerve to leave the safety of a steady paycheck. Halcyon days, she used to call it, the mythical stretch of calm that comes after a storm. She had always believed in him more than he'd believed in himself, and some nights, staring at invoice templates at 2 in the morning, he found himself talking to her out loud, the way he still sometimes did when the house was quiet enough. The first client was a small regional credit union that had lost $40,000 to a phishing attack before anyone noticed the breach. Ethan spent 3 weeks, most of them well past the hours he'd originally quoted, unpaid, because he refused to leave the job half-finished, rebuilding their entire authentication architecture from the ground up. He fell asleep some nights at his desk with his laptop still open, woke to Lily gently shaking his shoulder, telling him breakfast was ready because she'd learned to make cereal and toast herself rather than wait for him to surface. When he finished the project, the credit union's operations director, a soft-spoken woman named Diane Ferris, who'd been skeptical of hiring a one-man startup in the first place, sat across from him in her office and said, "In 20 years working with vendors, I have never once had someone care this much about something that wasn't even flashy. You didn't just patch the hole, Ethan. You made the whole boat better than it was before the leak." "That's the job," Ethan said simply. If I'm only going to fix what's broken and leave the rest fragile, I'm not actually doing anything worth paying for. Diane hired Halcyon for 2 more projects over the following year and told 2 other credit unions about him besides. One of those told a regional hospital network that had spent a year quietly terrified of the kind of ransomware attack that had crippled a competitor the year before, freezing patient records for 11 days and nearly costing lives in the process. The hospital network's IT director, a nervous man named Walter Kim, called Ethan at 9 at night after a board meeting where the topic had come up yet again, practically pleading. "Everyone we've talked to wants to sell us a product," Walter said. "You're the first person who asked me what actually keeps me up at night before quoting me a price." Word spread the way it spreads in small, honest businesses, not through advertising campaigns or cold outreach, but through the slow, compounding weight of people telling other people the same simple sentence. This guy actually does what he says he'll do. It was not by any means an easy road. There were months Ethan wasn't certain he'd make rent on the tiny shared office space he eventually moved Halcyon into, a narrow room above a dry cleaner that still smelled faintly of chemical steam no matter how many candles he burned. Months he ate cereal for dinner so Lily could have something better. Months he sat in his car in the school parking lot, unable to walk inside for pickup, because he'd just come off a 4-hour call with a panicked client screaming at him about money they'd already lost before he was ever brought in to help. There was one particular night, 8 months into the business, when he sat alone at the kitchen table with a stack of unpaid invoices spread out in front of him like a losing hand of cards, doing exhausted, hollowed-out math that kept landing on the same uncomfortable number, wondering seriously for the first time whether he'd made a catastrophic mistake walking away from the safety of Titan's paycheck. He thought about calling Marcus. He thought about how easy it would be to email HR, apologize for the abrupt exit, ask if there was still a place for him somewhere in the org chart, even a lesser one. He got as far as opening a blank email before he closed the laptop entirely, unable to finish the thought. Lily came downstairs in her pajamas because she couldn't sleep, and found him with his head in his hands. "Dad?" He looked up too fast, tried to arrange his face into something reassuring, and failed. She climbed into the chair beside him without asking permission, the way children do when they sense something is wrong and haven't yet learned the adult habit of pretending not to notice. "Is it the company?" "It's a lot of things, sweetheart. Grown-up stuff, money stuff, nothing for you to worry about. Are we going to be okay?" He wanted badly to hand her an easy answer, something small and comforting and untrue. He didn't. "I don't know yet," he admitted, "but I know I'm not going to stop trying. And I know that whatever happens, it's going to happen because I tried to build something honest, not because I gave up the first time it got hard." Lily rested her chin on her hand, thinking. Mum used to say something like that. She said being scared doesn't mean you stop. It just means it matters. Ethan hadn't heard that particular phrase spoken aloud in years, not since before Sarah's diagnosis, and hearing it now at midnight from his 8-year-old daughter over a kitchen table covered in overdue invoices, something in his chest cracked open that he'd kept carefully sealed for a long time. He pulled her into his side, and they sat there together in the quiet kitchen for a long while, and somewhere in that hour, something in him quietly reset. Not fixed, not solved, just reset, the way a server sometimes comes back online after a long outage, not because the underlying problem has been resolved, but because someone simply refused to stop trying to bring it back up. The next morning, bleary but resolved, Ethan called Walter Kim back and closed the hospital network deal, at a price that finally, for the first time, gave Halcyon real breathing room. He hung up the phone, sat alone in his kitchen, and allowed himself just for a moment to cry. Not from sadness, but from the strange, disorienting relief of having survived something he genuinely hadn't been sure he would survive. Halcyon grew, slowly at first and then all at once. By the end of the first year, Ethan had hired 2 engineers, both former Titan employees who'd reached out quietly after watching, with growing alarm, what was happening under Jason Cole's leadership. One of them was Tomas Reyes, who called Ethan on a Sunday afternoon and said simply, "I can't watch this place burn down anymore, and I trust you more than I trust anyone still in that building." The other was a quiet, meticulous young engineer named Farah Osei, fresh off a layoff at a competitor, who turned out to have an almost supernatural instinct for finding vulnerabilities other people missed, and who became, within a year, one of Halcyon's most valuable hires. By the end of the second year, Halcyon had 30 employees, a real office lease in a converted warehouse space with exposed brick and mismatched furniture Ethan had bought second-hand, and a growing client roster that eventually included 2 Fortune 500 companies, neither of whom had found Halcyon through marketing, but through the same 6 words that kept following Ethan around the industry, spoken quietly at conferences and in private messages between people who'd once worked with him. He actually does what he says. Meanwhile, back at Titan, the slow leak that had started the day of that all-staff announcement became, over time, a flood. Jason Cole's pet project, a total infrastructure overhaul designed by an outside consulting firm that had never actually operated at Titan's scale, was delivered 18 months late and wildly over budget. Priya had raised concerns about the migration plan in 3 separate meetings, each time more carefully worded than the last, each time politely dismissed. "We appreciate the caution," Jason had told her once in front of a dozen other engineers, "but sometimes the old guard just isn't built for where we're taking this company." Priya had gone home that night and cried out of sheer frustration, then called Ethan, who listened without saying "I told you so" because he never once said it. Not that night and not any night after. The overhaul failed its first real stress test during the biggest sales weekend of the year, taking the entire platform offline for 11 straight hours and costing Titan's retail clients an estimated $40 million in lost transactions combined. 3 of the company's 5 largest clients terminated their contracts within the same fiscal quarter. Investors who had tolerated the founder's nepotism as an eccentric indulgence for a year or 2 began demanding real answers at increasingly tense board meetings. Titan's stock, which had traded steadily for over a decade, dropped 31% in 4 months. Priya, who had stayed on through all of it, loyal not to the title of CTO but to the systems and colleagues she still cared about, called Ethan every few weeks just to talk, careful never to suggest he should feel any satisfaction in what was happening. She knew him too well for that. "I keep thinking I should feel something when I hear this stuff," Ethan admitted to her one evening, sitting on his back porch with Lily's bicycle propped against the railing and a single security light buzzing faintly over the yard. "Relief, vindication, something. I don't feel any of that. I just feel sad, honestly. Those systems, Priya, I built those to last 30 years. Watching them get torn apart by somebody who doesn't understand why they were built that particular way in the first place, it's like watching somebody burn down a house you spent your whole life carefully renovating, room by room." "You could say something," Priya offered gently. "You could call Marcus directly, tell him exactly what's happening on the ground." "He'd have to ask me first," Ethan said. "And even then, I gave that company 12 years of my life, Priya. I'm not giving it my dignity on top of that." Marcus Cole, watching the empire he'd spent 22 years building come apart in the hands of the son he loved, eventually did something billionaires rarely do in public. He admitted, in a tense, closed-door board meeting that later leaked to a trade publication, that he had made a serious mistake. One board member, an early investor named Ruth Alvarado, who had backed Titan since its garage days, reportedly told Marcus in that meeting, "You didn't just promote the wrong person, Marcus. You let the right one walk out the door and said nothing." Jason was quietly reassigned to a newly invented role, Vice President of Strategic Partnerships, a title with no direct reports and no real authority, the corporate equivalent of a gold watch handed out for a job poorly done. A search firm was hired to find a new CTO. Every single candidate who came in for an interview asked, at some point in the process, some version of the exact same question. What ever happened to Ethan Walker? It was Priya, almost exactly 3 years to the day after Ethan had walked out of Titan carrying a cardboard box, who called him with news that made her voice shake slightly, with something between disbelief and anticipation. "Marcus wants to see you," she said. "Personally, he asked me for your number himself. Ethan, I think he's coming to Halcyon's office. Tomorrow, if you'll have him." Ethan sat with that for a long moment after he hung up. He thought about the atrium, the applause, the silence of 400 people who had refused to meet his eyes. He thought about cereal for dinner, invoices at midnight, Lily's small hand finding his under the kitchen table on the worst night of the last 3 years. "Let him come," he said finally, mostly to himself. "I've got nothing to hide from that man anymore." Marcus Cole arrived the next afternoon in a car that looked distinctly out of place on Halcyon's modest street, wearing a suit that cost more than Ethan's first month of office rent, and for the first time in the 12 years Ethan had known him, he looked genuinely old. Not just aged, worn down, carrying the particular exhaustion of a man who has watched something he loved slip through his own hands and has finally, belatedly, understood his own part in losing it. They sat together in Ethan's office, which had a window overlooking a modest parking lot rather than a skyline, and a framed photograph of Sarah and Lily on the desk instead of an industry award, and Marcus looked around the room with an expression Ethan couldn't quite name at first, something caught between admiration and grief. "You built all this in 3 years, Marcus said. It wasn't phrased as a question. "Client by client," Ethan said simply. "The slow way, the only way I know how." Marcus exhaled slowly, and for a moment the practiced showman fell away entirely, replaced by something rawer and more honest. "I'm going to say something I should have said 3 years ago, and I know saying it now doesn't undo anything that happened between then and now. I was wrong, not just about the promotion. I was wrong about what actually held that entire company together. I thought it was capital, vision, my name on the building lobby. It wasn't any of that. It was you. It was 12 years of decisions nobody ever saw you make, fires nobody knew you'd put out before they ever became visible fires. I didn't just lose an employee that day in the atrium, Ethan. I lost the one person quietly holding the whole company up, and I didn't even understand that's what you'd been doing the entire time until it was gone." Ethan let the apology sit in the room for a long moment, rather than rushing to fill the silence with a forgiveness Marcus hadn't yet earned. "I'm here to offer you the CTO position," Marcus finally continued. "Full authority this time, no interference. Not from me, not from Jason, not from anyone on the board. Millions in equity, a complete rebuild of the platform, entirely your way, on your terms, no questions asked. I'm asking you to come back and save the company you already saved once, whether I appreciated it at the time or not." It was, by any reasonable measure, the offer of a lifetime, the kind of vindication most people who've been deeply wronged only ever get to imagine, delivered in person, by the very man who had wronged him, backed with real money and real power. Ethan thought about it seriously, because he owed himself that much honesty. He thought about Priya and Thomas, still holding systems together at Titan that deserved better stewardship than they'd received. He thought about Farah, who had built an entire threat detection framework at Halcyon, that he was quietly proud of in a way that had nothing to do with money. He thought about what it would mean to walk back into that atrium, not carrying a cardboard box, but carrying real authority, the kind that could finally fix what had been broken. And then, through the glass wall of his office, he saw Lily in the small reception area. 11 years old now, sitting on the worn couch, Halcyon kept there for exactly this reason, doing her math homework with headphones on, completely at ease in a space that existed only because he'd refused to let one unfair afternoon define the rest of his life. She glanced up, caught him watching her, and gave him a small, easy wave before turning back to her worksheet. Something in Ethan settled quietly and completely, the way a foundation settles once it's finally finished curing. "Marcus," he said, "for 12 years I built your dream. I gave it everything I had, and when it mattered most, it wasn't enough to be considered, because I wasn't your blood. I've made my peace with that. I don't say it with anger anymore. But I'm not interested in going back to build somebody else's dream a second time. I've spent the last 3 years building my daughter's. This company is going to be something she inherits, not because her name is on a piece of paper that guarantees it, but because she watched every single brick of it get laid, one at a time, during the hardest years of both our lives. I'm not walking away from that. Not for any amount of money, and not even for the vindication you're offering me right now, which, I'll be honest with you, is tempting." Marcus nodded slowly, and something like real respect, untouched by hierarchy, unearned by leverage, crossed his tired face. "I understand," he said quietly. "I think, honestly, I'd have been disappointed in you if you'd said yes." He stood to leave, then paused at the office door. "For what it's worth, Ethan, she's a lucky kid." "I'm the lucky one," Ethan said. "She's the reason I remembered who I was on the nights I'd forgotten." 6 months later, Titan Technologies was acquired by a larger conglomerate in a deal that stripped Marcus Cole of controlling interest entirely and quietly, permanently retired Jason Cole from any operational role in the tech industry. Nobody at Halcyon celebrated. There was nothing worth celebrating in watching a company collapse, even one that had once wronged you. Only a sober awareness that some lessons arrived too late to save the thing they were meant to protect. Priya finally left Titan the same month the acquisition closed, taking a role as Halcyon's head of infrastructure, telling Ethan on her first day, "I should have followed you 3 years ago. I just wasn't brave enough yet." Halcyon Security, meanwhile, opened its own headquarters that same spring. A real building at last, not a converted garage bedroom or a warehouse above a dry cleaner, with its name spelled out in brushed steel letters above the entrance and 300 employees who had built something honest together. One careful client at a time, during years when nobody was watching and nobody expected them to succeed. On opening day, Ethan stood in the lobby beneath the new sign, watching his employees and their families move through the space. He watched Priya laughing near the coffee station with Thomas and Farah and Diane Ferris, who'd flown in specially for the occasion, and Walter Kim, who'd brought his whole IT department along like it was a field trip. Lily, 12 now, stood beside her father in a dress she'd picked out herself, looking up at the logo above the entrance. "You did it," she said. "We did it," Ethan corrected gently. "Every hard night, every grilled cheese Tuesday, every time you reminded me to keep going when I didn't think I had it in me. That's half of this building right there, standing next to me." Lily reached up and hugged him tightly, the way she used to when she was small enough to be carried, and said quietly into his shoulder, "Mom would be proud." Ethan looked past her, out through the glass doors to the parking lot, where his old cardboard box, the same one he'd carried out of Titan 3 years earlier, still sat folded flat in the trunk of his car, a strange, private memento he had never quite been able to throw away. He didn't need it as a reminder of what he'd lost anymore. He kept it now for a different reason entirely, proof that sometimes the box they hand you on your very worst day turns out to be exactly the size and shape of the thing you'll need one day to carry something that finally belongs to no one but you. He looked up at the logo bearing his family's name, glowing steady in the afternoon sun, and understood at last, completely, that he had built something no title, no boardroom, and no billionaire's apology could ever take from him again. If this story moved you, that pause before you scroll away is exactly the moment to hit like. And if you want more stories like Ethan's, the quiet ones, about people who lose everything and still find a way to rebuild it with their own 2 hands, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss the next one. Drop a comment and let me know, would you have taken Marcus's offer, or would you have walked away like Ethan did? I read every single one. See you in the next story.